Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, July 31st, 2021, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the only 2022 United States Senate polls. And the reason why I want to do this is because in my channel, in years past, I have covered polls right as they've been released. But there seems to be a sudden decrease in polling from major polling firms after many inaccuracies in the 2020 presidential election. Unfortunately, that puts us in a position where we don't have much data ahead of the midterm elections the year leading up to it. Now, while I don't expect a number of polls to be out, many of these states that are in yellow on your screen, 11 of which have polls within them, but sometimes they are singular polls from March, February, January that might not necessarily provide the best picture, but it's all we can work with. And I'm one who does like to follow the numbers. I do like to use data in a lot of my analysis, but it does make it difficult when there isn't a lot of data out there. But for the sake of this video, I have used FiveThirtyEight's tool and looked at every single one of the United States Senate polls, average them out for all of the 11 states, and I will apply that to a map, and we'll talk about the individual results and why they may be interesting or more so expected. So, you can see here that there are 11 states that are under the polled states. There's actually one state in particular, and that is the state of Vermont, which has a poll, but the reason why I'm not covering, and you might find this noticeable in some of the other polls that I use to average, I will not count the declined candidate. So if someone says they are not running for United States Senate, I will not use that in the average. And that applies to the Vermont Senate election. You can actually see here on the U.S. Senate polls that in Vermont, there was one poll taken back in, I believe, January 27th, 2021, in Vermont, asking voters would they vote for Phil Scott, the incumbent governor, a very popular Republican, or Patrick Leahy, a very popular Democrat in the United States Senate, one of the longest serving senators in United States history. So in Vermont, there was that one poll, but Phil Scott said almost immediately after this that he was certainly not running for United States Senate, saying he has absolutely no interest there, and he's much happier in the state of Vermont. So I just looked at this and said, it's obviously safe Democratic. Back in 2016, the Democrats won here with 61% of the vote, not necessarily competitive, and this guy actually ran for lieutenant governor in 2020. Let's see how he did. But point being that in this Senate election in 2016, it was not at all competitive. Patrick Leahy won by an overwhelming amount, never really faced a competitive race in recent history, and will certainly not face one in 2022. So now that we're back onto a regular track, let's start filling in all of the states that do not have polls in them, and it is quite unfortunate to see. I also want to use this as an opportunity to talk to you guys essentially about the state of the race in many of the Senate elections. I will be updating you guys tomorrow or the day after in August to give you more of an idea of how the Senate elections are unfolding around the nation. It's my monthly update leading up to the midterm elections. Not many drastic changes, if at all, just that we would like to update where we are now, and pretty much just based off of more and more news and more emerging threats, concerns, and opinions of American voters around the nation. So for these 11 states, we are going to work from the West Coast over to the East Coast, and it shouldn't be too difficult. Now, some of the races on the East Coast are far more competitive than the ones on the West Coast, which just so happens to work out. We start out with the state of Washington, which we can actually take a look at. In my prediction, I will be comparing it back and forth as a safe Democratic seat. And my suspicions and my prediction seems to be correct right now. Patty Murray, the incumbent United States Senator from the state of Washington, has a safe margin to victory in this poll. We can actually see here that she defeats the Republican opponent by 16 points, which is enough to put Washington in the safe Democratic column. There that state goes. And then moving on, you had the state of Alaska, which technically came before the state of Washington, but I decided to go from the actual western coast of the United States, what we would define as the West Coast. But in the state of Alaska, while this is not necessarily a turnover by party, it is a turnover of an incumbent, but not through a primary. You see, Alaska is interesting. Alaska has a ranked choice voting method which allows voters to rank their nominees all on one ballot from 1 to 5 and put them in a determining order as to who they would prefer over the next. And as the final ballot was to move on and on and on, it ended up between a Democrat and a Republican, Kelly Tshibaka being that Republican, and she defeats the Democrat Al Gross by 8 points. But even faced on a generic ballot once, a one-round type ballot, a plurality victory, which is no longer possible in Alaska, she still wins by a likely margin, a 14-point margin. So while I'm going to keep Alaska in the likely margin for the sake of the victory over the other Republican, I want you to understand that that is just based off of the final rounds. It could end up with 2 Republicans, which of course would consequently make the race safe Republican. Then we have the state of Arizona, a likely Democratic state. Wondering why? Well, if you take a look at the numbers in the state of Arizona, it does not seem that anyone is Mark Kelly's match. And this actually reminds me of the early times in the race between Martha McSally and Mark Kelly. Immediately after her being appointed as the nominee, the public in the state of Arizona turned on her. They did not want her in the United States Senate. They said, we kicked you out, or not kicked you out, we voted against you in 2018, and all of a sudden, Governor Ducey turns on us and nominates you to the Senate. Kelly took very large leads, 10-point leads, and while he certainly did not win by 10 points, won by around 3 percentage points, this was an early indication that Kelly was going to have a victory, as it was for Kyrsten Sinema, and I see the same thing happening in 2022. So am I surprised by these numbers? Maybe if this was the final margin of a 10-point margin, but early on, absolutely not. Mark Kelly, I personally as well believe, is on a pathway to victory. Not by a likely margin as told by these polls, but certainly by a lean margin, maybe a tilt margin in a bad case for him. So, moving on to the state of Colorado, Michael Bennett. Does his name ring a bell? I talked about him briefly in the 2020 presidential election season. He ran for president of the United States. We only have one poll here. His race was actually competitive back in 2016. He won by just around 5-6 points. Today, he stands at a 13-point advantage. And the reason why that isn't super shocking is because Joe Biden actually won Colorado by 13.5%. So if anything, he's on par with Joe Biden, enough to put Colorado in the likely Democratic column. And then you're moving over. You're about crossing halfway through the United States, down the red wall there, and you're hitting the state of Missouri. Now, I know what you might be thinking. Why are we even talking about Missouri? Isn't it just like Washington in terms of how safe it is? Well, the answer is no. Right now, Eric Greitens, who is a former statewide official, who has had a lot of scandals to his name, who has been ostracized by many members of the Republican Party, and especially the Democratic Party, is now running for United States Senate and could actually make this race competitive. And I'll show you what I mean. The numbers show. Sorry about the abrupt cut. My screen recorder stopped working, but we were talking about Eric Greitens and him as the former governor of the state who has fallen out of favor within the voters, the people that elected him before, who now seems to be polling very poorly against potential Democratic nominees, +4, +7, compared to his counterpart, other potential Republican nominee of +8 and +12. Regardless, though, of no matter who the nominee would be, Missouri actually finds itself in the likely Republican column, and this actually might not surprise too many people, considering how competitive Missouri was back in 2016. Now, if you do a little bit of electoral history, Claire McCaskill is a Democrat who served in the state of Missouri up until 2019. She served as a senator. She was someone who had done very well for a Democrat in the state. But I also do need to point out that Missouri almost had 2 Democratic senators after the 2016 election. I don't know if the name Jason Kander rings a bell to too many of you guys, but if you closely watched the 2016 election season, Jason Kander had a very good shot at winning the Senate race in the state of Missouri. In fact, only lost by less than 3 points, despite Hillary Clinton losing by well over 15 points, well over a safe margin of victory for Donald Trump. So there was an overwhelming amount of support and crossover appeal between Trump supporters and Kander supporters. And the reason for that is because he was a statewide official. He was a very recognizable name, a very strong candidate. I remember his ads back in 2016, watching them. They were absolutely incredible. So looking at the competitive nature of Missouri in the past, this exact Senate race, I can sort of see why it might be competitive in the future, just considering that it has had that history. But I will say that there is clearly one Republican who is much worse for the party than the other in the state of Missouri, and that is Eric Greitens, who really I will expect and do expect many of these Republicans to send money in there to ensure that he does not win that primary, the same way they focused on Chris Kobach as the preventing him from becoming the Republican nominee in the Kansas Senate race in 2020. But moving beyond Missouri, this is our first likely a Republican state besides Alaska, but Alaska is tricky because it could end up with 2 Republicans. This is the first time we've seen it as a likely Republican state, really, when it is widely expected to be a Democrat versus Republican race. Moving over to the state of Wisconsin, this is actually not a good state for the Republican Party currently. We have seen Ron Johnson, who has floated running, floated not running time and time again, who is now facing off against Tom Nelson in the state of Wisconsin. We can actually show you these numbers here, where you see here that Nelson defeats him by around 4 points, which isn't an overwhelming large margin, I should say. I do want to point that out, that I don't see this as an irreversible pathway for the GOP. But typically speaking, as an incumbent, you should be winning in your race. And typically speaking, in Senate elections, incumbents almost always win. You see, the thing about congressional races is that the American public loves to vote based off of their own personal experience. If they are happy with where the state stands currently, or if they are in a good position, they will likely re-elect voters, re-elect candidates, the same way they do on the presidential level. Now, for Tom Nelson in the state of Wisconsin, it seems that the voters might be fed up with Ron Johnson, who has ran on an otherwise very Trumpy type style of campaigning, despite being in one of the closest states in terms of swing states in the American political system. I mean, Wisconsin only went to Biden by 0.6%. But now that Nelson is taking a 4-point lead, I question whether or not Ron Johnson's rhetoric is working. I've always described it as being poor for a Republican in the state that is so competitive, such as Wisconsin. And I also expect the margin to be a lean margin for the Democratic Party. So I'm not shocked by these numbers, but I will say that this is the first of many warning signs for the GOP in Wisconsin. And it seems as if they believe that they are comfortable with Ron Johnson as the nominee, or potentially not, but these numbers typically do not lie. And Wisconsin, the last time they had a Senate election was in 2018, and the Democrat won there by over 10 points. Moving on to the state of Ohio, which is not more westward than Florida, but Florida is just a very large state, and it also does end up with a solid color, so I'd rather move over to a more competitive race. But in Ohio, this is a lean Republican race. And this actually would not be the case had Amy Acton, the former director of health in the state of Ohio, was running, but that is not the case. It seems as if Tim Ryan is going to be the sure nominee in the state. This is an A- rated pollster. It's public policy polling, and it actually has some type of Democratic lean. But you see here that Tim Ryan, the representative from the state of Ohio, a very well-known name, actually ran for president in 2020, is losing to every single Republican, but not by as large of a margin as Joe Biden lost to Donald Trump. You see, in Ohio, Donald Trump won by 8 points, but Tim Ryan seems to be only losing by 2 points, 3 points, 4 points. And while a loss for Democrats is a 6-year seat that they can't win back until 2028, it isn't as bad as it was back in 2020, which might indicate things that might be beneficial to them. But overall, the Democrats are losers in this race based off of the initial polling data. So now we can move on to the state of Georgia, which has a very competitive race as well. Georgia is a state that was very close in 2021, went to Joe Biden narrowly in 2020. So looking at the state of Georgia, currently speaking, Warnock does have an advantage. And I do think that a lot of these polls, I forgot to point this out in the beginning, is very dependent on how Joe Biden is received by the public. If Joe Biden's approval rating goes down, I can tell you now, many of these races are going to take a turn. You need to have a popular incumbent president to ride the wave of the incumbent. Otherwise, you are going to distance yourself. But for many of these Senate candidates, they have embraced Joe Biden and his policies in open arms, the same way many Democrats did leading up to the 2010 midterms, leading up to the 2014 midterms, and were absolutely blown out by insane margins. So looking at 2022, a lot of it is dependent on Joe Biden, but right now, keep these polls in mind with the understanding that Joe Biden has been in the popular approval rating for the entirety of a lot of these numbers, a lot of these polls. Not a single time so far has Joe Biden been an unpopular president. But in Georgia, like I said, Raphael Warnock takes a lead, a narrow lead of just 2 points. This is an averaged poll between, we have Kelly Loeffler, who ran for this Senate race and lost to and lost to Raphael Warnock, there are times where rerun candidates resurface, as there was in 2016. And looking at that, you also have Herschel Walker, who is floated as a potential name, who defeats Warnock by 2 points, but then again, understanding the Trafalgar Group, a C- rated pollster, actually might have been bumped up to A-, but regardless, has some type of Republican advantage, does have an R by its name on Real Clear Politics, still a conservative pollster that doesn't release its methodology, really has that rating largely because of its accuracies in the past, but is still only 67% accurate. So I would say that that's right. I mean, you're right 67% of the time. It's something to be proud about, but I will say that I do take this pollster in with caution because they have missed the mark, even in Georgia, especially predicting that we would see a Warnock loss of 7 points leading up to the runoff elections. So looking in the state of Georgia right now, a lean Democrat characterization, Warnock taking a lead by around 2 points, and then moving on to the state of Florida, and I'm actually going to speedrun Florida because there isn't much else to see other than the fact that Marco Rubio has an overwhelming large victory. Am I surprised by a 21-point margin? Absolutely. I think it should be lean. It should be anywhere between 5 and 15%. It might be on the upper end. It might be on the lower end. Do I buy a 20-point margin? No. But I'm not going to argue with these numbers. I did not conduct the survey, and surveys sometimes can be off. The unfortunate thing is we don't have many polls from the state of Florida, so we're working what we're given with, but I don't expect it to be as Republican, but I do expect it to be pretty Republican respective to the rest of the nation. Moving over to the state of Pennsylvania, I have this state as a lean Democratic race. Surprisingly, the polls have it as a likely Democratic race. This is one poll with John Fetterman faced off against two potential Republicans. Fetterman defeats the first by 8. The second by 10 points. And then moving on to the final race, the state of New Hampshire, where Maggie Hassan is expected to be in a very competitive race against potentially Chris Sununu. That is partially correct. The polls do show that Sununu is the closest incumbent, but based off of all of the potential nominees, all of the candidates running, you have one candidate already announced, two of which are actively encouraging speculation. Maggie Hassan still wins this race by an average of around 5 points. So that's enough to put New Hampshire in the lean Democratic column that finalizes our map, and guess exactly where it puts us. It seems to be a near representation of what my own personal prediction is. Now, I don't want you to get it confused. I haven't seen many of these polls before I made this prediction. In fact, many of them were not determined based off of these polls. As you can see, in some of these states, the margins are very, very different, or sometimes spot on. But I do want to point out that the data doesn't seem to be too far off from what I'm suggesting, but I will say that there will be some changes in the future in these polls, in these predictions. The American political system is not finalized a year and a half before the election. There is still a long way to go until November 2022, or about a year and a quarter actually at this point, but there's still so much more to happen, so much more to explore, so much more data to be released, and I just want to give you a glimpse and a good understanding of where the polls stand today. So currently speaking, they give Democrats pickup opportunities in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, and they solidify both of them. Republicans are able to retain every single one of the remaining races, as are Democrats. All of the incumbents win. Not a single incumbent ousted except for Wisconsin, but we don't know entirely if Ron Johnson is going to be running or not. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.